Hello and welcome back to Season 4 of the Ask podcast, where we hope you will be attaining some excellent secret knowledge with us today. Lovely to be back for the new academic year with some new guests, but also some returning guests, as I will reveal to you very, very soon. But first to say, just to remind you, I'm Mrs Summers, the Deputy Head of English and Drama at John Hampden Grammar School.
And I'm Mr Till. I'm the Head of English and do things with the sixth form these days as well. If you're listening, we are very, very pleased that you're listening. Mm-hmm. And we have a winner as well. So there was an episode that we did on, it seemed ages ago, but you can find it on the stream, that Mrs Forge did all about printing. And I set a challenge in that episode, and it was what the letters A, T, C, C, N, what that had to do with anything. And Ben, whose surname I probably can't say, can I, on the podcast?
You can say his first letter of it.
Ben M. in year 13 got it, that they were the first initials of the Roman emperors. So from Augustus to Tiberius and Claudius and Caligula and Nero. So congratulations to Ben, who wins a cake and lots of other great stuff. Well there might be a puzzle in this one if I think of one really quickly.
We are so prepared today, as you can tell. Let me now introduce our wonderful panellists who both do A-level English, so they are, absolute stars. That goes without saying.
And A-level history as well, actually.
Oh, I mean, even better.
Dare I say it?
Even better. Okay, we've given away some of you, but introduce yourselves, your name, and something about you.
I'm Josh. I do history, English, chemistry, and law, and first time on the show, so very excited.
Wonderful.
Great to have you.
I'm Matthew, and similar to Josh, I do English, history and law, but I do geography instead, and it is my second time on the podcast, and I come here on my own free will today.
No kidnapping involved. I'm glad we've clarified that. And perhaps, most importantly, our glorious returning guest, who was our inaugural guest, in fact, on our first podcast ever, and he has returned with a very different topic today. We have Mr Sawdon, Head of History and all-round fountain of knowledge, here to talk to us about all things nuclear. Or while he might choose to narrow that down somewhat, we will see. So I will start with our traditional question: is why this topic, please, sir?
Yeah, well, thank you very much for such an effusive introduction. I'll try and live up to that. So for me, I think I chose nuclear. It sounds rather vague because I think nuclear diplomacy has come back with a vengeance in recent times. So in particular, the fact that Vladimir Putin has been making veiled threats against Ukraine, saying that if Russia's territorial integrity is violated, then any means possible would be used in order to defend Russian territory. That's also complicated by the fact that the occupied areas of Ukraine are imminently to become part of the Russian sort of integral territory after these referendums. So it was something which the nuclear threat is something which I've always taught as something quite abstract and unfamiliar to students when we're learning about the Cold War. Whereas now it's got a modern relevance and perhaps a modern danger that's greater than it's been in a long time.
Wow. Nice, light-hearted, easygoing topic. State of the world today. Fab.
Absolutely. I went straight in there on the Russian invasion of Ukraine, yeah.
Straight in there on the end of the world is what you're saying. Brilliant. Okay, let's open it up for some questions. Does anybody fancy taking the first question?
I think my question would be, what is the...
Okay.
What is the first instance of nuclear weapons being produced and used?
Yeah, great question. Thank you. So the possibility of nuclear weapons being developed was something which scientists were aware of by 1939. So famously, Albert Einstein wrote a letter to President Roosevelt in 1939, which he since described as his greatest regret in life, in which he warned theoretical advancements in physics mean that we may be able to develop a weapon which is powerful enough to destroy an entire city or entire cities. In light of the danger that this may be developed by the Nazis, he urged President Roosevelt to proceed with a weapons research program. The irony, of course, is that Albert Einstein, who was a great pacifist, then through saying, watch out, these things might be invented, then began, it was like set in motion the chain of events, which then resulted in the Manhattan Project and in them being developed by the USA. So famously, the Manhattan Project, as it was called, which was actually it was a collaboration between British, Canadian, and American scientists. There's a very famous quote when they actually have a successful atom bomb test, where J. Robert Oppenheimer, who was one of the leaders of the Manhattan Project, said he felt at that moment, "I am become death. I am the destroyer of worlds." And he says we all felt that one way or another. So that was some, and bear in mind, I come at this very much from the perspective of a historian and not a scientist. But even so, essentially the genesis comes in World War II, and then the Soviets are able to rapidly gain nuclear technology as well, partly because they have spies who are feeding information from the Manhattan Project. So famously, there was one called Klaus Fuchs, who was a British scientist who was leaking information to the Soviets that allowed them to build a bomb 4 years later by 1949. And then if the Russians had it, the British had to have it. And if the British had it, then the French had to have it. And if the French had it, the Chinese need to have it, and etc. And so proliferation has proceeded ever since.
Wow. Cheery. Go for it, Matthew.
Looking at sort of the state of mutually assured destruction you're describing, where all the nations around the world have these nuclear weapons and these strategic nuclear weapons, we've seen recently in the news that there's been a contrast created with strategic and other types of nuclear warheads that have less damage but are more used for attacks on tanks. Why is it that a country like Russia has so many more strategic weapons that they would never actually use than they do these much more smaller weapons that's used in actual combat?
Well, I suppose it's an aspect of national machismo, I suppose, and posturing, really. I mean, there are about 19,000 nuclear warheads in the world. 18,000 of them belong either to the USA or Russia. And they have the capacity to be able to destroy the world dozens, if not hundreds of times over. So in that sense, they're practically obsolete. So there is no justification for those huge weapons beyond the fact that I suppose there's a sense that it adds to the kind of the weight and the gravitas that country has around the table. I mean, it's probably worth us saying that the largest ever nuclear detonation was the Tsar bomb, or the Emperor bomb, in 1961, and it was detonated sort of deep within the Arctic Circle by the Soviets. Now, that atom bomb was about 3,000 times more powerful than the atom bombs used on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, used on Japan in World War II. So when we're talking about nuclear weapons, the development of thermonuclear, sometimes called H-bombs, means that when we're thinking about nuclear weapons, the big ones are of a magnitude that makes the ones that were dropped in World War II absolutely minuscule by comparison. But yes, you're right to say that there has been the proliferation in recent years of what's called tactical nuclear weapons, which in theory could be used on the battlefield. And I think that is part of what people are most fearful of. I think onlookers and commentators are most worried that the Russian army might credibly use a tactical nuke, which in theory has a kind of more limited area of effect, and they could perhaps credibly be deployed.
The feasibility of these weapons, I suppose, it increases their fear and their power on the battlefield if Putin keeps having these setbacks that he's facing in Ukraine. Yeah,
because you mentioned mutually assured destruction, and just to summarise that, the idea is that in theory, two nuclear armed states wouldn't go to war, should never go to war with one another, because when one of them decides to use their weapons, the other would immediately retaliate with such overwhelming force that both would be destroyed. Destruction would be mutually assured. However, tactical nukes muddy the waters somewhat, and in a sense probably make it more complex and more uncertain. I don't know if we want to talk about this, I have some interesting stories as well of nuclear near misses.
Do you know what? My next question was, what's the closest we've ever come to world destruction?
Yeah, right.
Are you going to talk about that chap? Who was the chap who was the night officer at the Soviet base when the computer told him that the US had fired?
Exactly. Well, do you know what? We have not one but two little-known Soviet officials who are probably responsible for having saved the world from total annihilation. So, in 1962, at the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, so the Cuban Missile Crisis was the closest that the USA and Russia and the USSR, the Soviet Union, sometimes called Russia, it's the closest they ever came to a nuclear confrontation and to using nuclear weapons deliberately. But what people often don't realise is that actually the most dangerous point of the Cuban Missile Crisis was the fact that because tensions were so high, it greatly increased the likelihood of an unintentional or of misunderstanding and an unintentional deployment of nuclear weapons. That's exactly what happened in 1962. So this guy called Vasily Arkhipov was one of the officers on board a nuclear submarine off the coast of Florida in 1962. Now, they had been deep below sea and had been cut off from any communication with the outside world for a number of days at the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The US Air Force then started dropping dummy depth charges. They detected that there was a submarine there. They started to essentially deploying these dummies to sort of force the submarine to surface, like identify yourself, who are you and what are you doing off the coast of Florida. Mm-hmm. However, to the crew who had been cut off from the world, they thought these were real depth charges. They thought that their submarine was being attacked. So the inference that was made by the officers on board was, well, it's happening. World War III has broken out. And so they then had to decide whether to deploy the nuclear weapons they had on board. This submarine was primed with nuclear weapons. To launch those nuclear weapons, the three most senior officers on board had to agree. Two of the three officers said, yeah, let's do it. War has broken out. Let's fire our nuclear weapons at the USA. That would have then resulted in a massive retaliation from America, which would have resulted in a massive retaliation from Russia. The whole world would have been destroyed. The third man refused to give his agreement to those nuclear weapons being set off. So I think one of the scary things for us to consider and discuss is just how nuclear weapon systems are inherently human. They're controlled, they're operated by humans, and that means that they're prone to error. And then that's a similar one that you're referring to there, Mr. Till, from the 1980s. Stanislav Petrov, absolutely. So this was exercise. So there was a huge NATO war game operation happening next door. I think it was in 1983, and there were errors with the Soviet sort of missile detection system, which led to them to think that there had been, at the same time as this huge NATO war game, that there had been nuclear missiles launched at the USSR. And likewise, it came down to that one man on the ground refusing to retaliate, saying, just wait, there might be an error with our systems. We don't know if this attack has actually been launched. And the fact that we've come that close a couple of times. There are other ones as well.
He used just on that one, though, Petra. He used some logic, didn't he? Because the computer was telling him that they'd fired 5 warheads from the US. And he thought, well, that doesn't make sense. Like, if they're going to fire, it'd be a huge strike. Yeah. Or what they've done just doesn't make any sense. So he assumed it must be a computer glitch. Yeah. It's wonderful to be able to apply logic at that level, to be the person who either has to pick up the phone or not. That split-second decision has changed world history.
Absolutely.
Which is incredible thought, really.
The fact that it is inherently human, I think actually also decreases the fear of it a little bit, because if Russia had a dictator, or had a dictator, or has a dictator, whatever.
Imagine such a scenario.
Whatever you want to say. If it's in this scenario where you have one sole dictator being in control of nuclear weapons, it's the Russian officers and the generals in command that choose whether to actually fire. So I suppose that's also a second Fail-safe.
Fail-safe, yeah.
Yes.
Well, I think there was actually an American general who openly said, whilst Trump was president, we would not launch this. I think this was when Trump was in his phase of kind of, essentially provoking North Korea from the safety of his Twitter, and goodness knows. There's something called sole executive authority in the USA. So the president has the only ultimate say on the use of nuclear weapons. But the question is, what if the president wants to launch them and a military leadership really don't think it's wise? Well, this American general actually said we wouldn't obey an instruction if it was incredibly frivolous or trivial or ill-judged. So you're right. In essence, I suppose, learning about these nuclear crises helps us understand human behaviour a lot better. And you can take confidence from the fact that when we came within an inch of World War III in the Cuban Missile Crisis, Khrushchev and Kennedy, who were the leaders at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, actually sat down and realised that they had to de-escalate. But again, this is on the assumption that cool heads prevail. And, there's an analogy that we use for World War I, that the powers before World War I were essentially playing Russian roulette before World War I. And there had been a series of metaphorical sort of clicks of the trigger before the final crisis that actually started World War I. And it does just make you wonder, have we had a few metaphorical clicks of the trigger? I think we almost certainly have. Keeping it cheerful, like I say.
Yeah.
I associate that kind of real fear of nuclear war and Armageddon with the 1980s and a couple of moments in the 1980s, the Soviets invading Afghanistan and tensions. There was even a sitcom called Whoops Apocalypse, which tried to satirise how close the world came. And there was genuine fear. That seems to have died down. Why do you think that died down? Obviously the end of the Cold War, but are we too complacent about the fact that so many of these countries are still heavily armed with world-destroying weapons?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely explained by complacency globally. Of course, one of the great threats is of some rogue agent sort of essentially breaking into a nuclear weapon stockpile, because these bases are scattered all around, hundreds of them around remote areas of the USA and Russia. And, one of the great fears is of a terrorist organisation, for example, sort of getting hold of what's sometimes called a dirty bomb, where they just get one nuke and then set it off in order to cause chaos. So that's another fear that we also have to bear in mind. And I suppose that one thing that might have led to a certain degree of complacency is there were very concerted efforts at disarmament by the USA and USSR, which then became Russia in the 1990s. So, for example, one really interesting stat, I think, is the fact that as a result of the disassembly of so many of their nuclear weapons, the Americans were able to use the enriched uranium for their nuclear power stations. So they were able to, 10% for something like a 10-year period from 1990 to 2000, 10% of America's electricity came from nuclear power stations using fuel which came from dismantled nuclear weapons, which I think also provides an interesting kind of, I guess it kind of adds to the moral case for disarmament. It can actually result in a lot of clean energy being produced as well. But anyway, that's a
We could do
side
some
point.
of that right now, really, but there we go.
That's topical.
On the sort of notion of disarmament, in I guess more recent years, there's been controversy over the Trident missiles in the UK. So do you think there's any merit to those arguments of disarmament, or do you think it's too necessary to have nuclear weapons in this age?
Question.
Well, that's a great question, and I'm going to continue to be impartial ultimately and not give you an easy answer there. I think the Trident nuclear deterrent it runs into the billions of pounds, and you have to ask. I mean, President Eisenhower, who created NASA, he said of NASA, he said ultimately every rocket sent to space represents, in the final estimation, food being stolen from the world's poorest people. And that was the president who created NASA and created the space program who said that. And I think, again, if you think about the sheer levels of human ingenuity that have been poured into having the capacity to destroy the world hundreds of times over, and you think, well, where could that capacity be otherwise used or channeled? And in that sense, I suppose nuclear weapons are somewhat fiscally and morally indefensible. But then there's also that sense in which when the world is essentially metaphorically pointing a loaded gun at each other, do you want to be the first to lower your weapon? It would be a great and courageous moral thing to do, but really tricky to do. And by the way, really tricky to do politically. Like Jeremy Corbyn, the previous leader of the Labour Party, he was in favour of nuclear disarmament. And in the 2017 election, he got in a lot of hot water and was criticised by large sections of the media for refusing to say that he would ever contemplate using nuclear weapons. And there was this rather unusual situation where he was getting grilled in this TV debate in 2017, where an audience member said, "Would you use nuclear weapons?" And Theresa May said, "Well, yes, of course. In the final instance, yes, if I needed to, if British interests were at stake, yes, of course, there needs to be a credible deterrent." Whilst Jeremy Corbyn said, "No, I would never use nuclear weapons." And I think his popularity and his polling ratings suffered because he refused to say, yes, if I was forced to, I would incinerate hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people, in a retaliatory strike. And so actually, I think the British population is generally of the view, I haven't seen the stats on this, but generally of the view that actually nuclear weapons are a reality. The technology's been invented. The genie's out of the bottle. And in that sense, I think many people would say, arguably, the Ukrainian invasion shows actually perhaps nuclear weapons are an important part of an important aspect of the dynamic of diplomacy, at least the theoretical prospect that you could use them, if only in retaliation.
Does it also not show the failures of nuclear weapons, though, as we still have Russia sort of exploiting the fact that we could never really go actively to war against them due to NATO's power being almost equal to Russia, if not.
Well, is that a success of nuclear weapons? So the fact that the USA and the USSR were never able to go into direct confrontation with each other because they were both in possession of nuclear weapons. Like the individual Hiram Maxim who invented the machine gun, or a variant of the machine gun, he hoped that by inventing the machine gun, he would make the prospect of war so horrific and horrendous and brutal that nations would no longer go to war with one another. He was wrong. It turns out that nations were quite willing to spend years annihilating each other with those weapons. But I suppose with nuclear weapons, it's that same argument, but perhaps taken to an even greater degree. The sort of delicate dance that's going on in Ukraine, where the UK and the US and NATO allies are providing Ukraine with weapons, but only enough weapons to repel the Russian invasion, not to invade Russia. That delicate dance that ultimately has, tragic though of course the war is for those involved, it has had an impact. The fact that both sides are nuclear armed, it has limited and set very clear boundaries for what the parameters of that war must be, in theory.
I'm very sad to call us away from this lovely discussion. Lovely discussion is an interesting description, but I think we are running short on time. And I remember that Sir did not experience our quick-fire question round.
Crikey!
We have to go
So,
quick-fire. So
this is a lot more light-hearted. You'll be pleased to know.
Shall the quick-fire round begin? Okay, favourite nuclear weapon? No, I'm joking. It's going to be a light-hearted quick-fire round. Let's go with. If you could teach another subject, what would you teach?
It would be English.
Yes. There we go. Yeah.
I did it at A level. Loved it.
Favourite takeaway on a Friday evening?
For me, it's just a bog standard chicken tikka masala.
Nice. If you could be any animal.
So there are many aspects in which I think I am an elephant. I'll go for an elephant. I mean, I'm not describing my physical appearance, but anyway, they've got good memories in
If you
it.
could steal any work of art, what would you want on your wall?
Wow, I find the question so morally repulsive. I can't even think about it. Edvard Munch's The Scream.
Wow.
That one's always interested me.
Nice.
Keep you up at night.
Top 3 biscuits.
Oh, I was going to go top 1. biscuit,
Not
but
a big biscuit eater. Party rings number 1, nothing else.
party rings.
Cheers. Chip in with the quick 5 questions. Things that we want to know about Mr Sawdon?
Favourite movie?
Ooh.
Yikes. Okay. A 1970s film called Network. It's great. I'm not going to explain why.
Gonna go away and watch that.
Wait a moment.
Favourite history class taught?
Ah.
Well, a teacher never does have favourites. I am most impressed by the results of last summer's Year 11, which you just so happen to be part of, Matthew. So there you are.
Darn. Wonderful.
On that note.
That was great. We
Yeah.
learnt lots.
We did.
Elephants, lack of biscuits. I feel enriched, and also lots of nuclear stuff too.
Absolutely.
earlier.
I think we've helped forge the English history bond as well.
Absolutely. Reinforce it, of course.
Yeah.
Reinforce it. It was already strong.
It's maths and science. People on the curriculum, maths and science are friends.
Yeah.
I think English and history are friends too.
And MFL.
I think history should be
MFL.
compulsory at GCSE. That's a controversial
Gosh,
opinion,
that's
but-
maybe we
Agreed.
should do that for a debating topic
Yeah,
in the future.
I think so.
Thank you for giving us a debating topic,
Yeah,
sir.
history's great.
Absolutely. Wonderful. What a brilliant time we've had today. Our guest is so, as I said, full of knowledge. There's just so much of it spilling out. I wish we had more time to go into even more depth, despite the slight underlying horror I feel when we're talking about these topics at the end of the world. It's still absolutely fascinating. So thank you for that. As per usual, follow us on YouTube, subscribe. It's under my name, Jenny Summers. Follow us on Twitter at JHGS English. Spread the word. on
Email
word of
in,
mouth.
tell us that you want to be a guest. Tell us
Yes.
which teachers you might like
Yeah.
and what their topic could
What
be.
topics? Yeah, that's always
Get
good.
involved. If you email in, you get house points, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Do you have any quick quiz questions?
No, there's no quiz for today, but email in, you get a house point this week, and maybe there'll be a
All
quiz
right, fair
next
enough. Fair enough. And maybe I'll
week. A cryptic clue.
Okay, I mean, I can't believe Ben got that previous one, but
I know, right? I thought I was going to be able to milk that for another month. And Ben was, that's genius
got
levels.
straight in there.
Yeah.
And of course, thank you to our wonderful production team. We've got Thomas H. Confusingly, not Tom H from last year. We've got Thomas H now, who was a fabulous member of my English GCSE class last year, I have to say, and is now our very able tech team leader. Yeah, he's just reminding me of his wonderful grades with show of hands, which were brilliant. And I've got other fantastic English GCSE students who've been wonderful panellists today. So thank you to our brilliant panellists for your excellent, well thought out questions on a range of different topics. Thank you to our fabulous guest, Mr Sawdon, our returning guest, and just as high quality as last time, and I really enjoyed it. Is there anything else I've missed, sir?
Just to say, we'll see you next time.
Yes, and hopefully, I'm going to say this on the podcast so they have to come on. We should be having Mr. Khan and Mr. Durrant from English coming up, all right? We're going to start rolling these quick and fast before I go on maternity leave. That is my plan. So I've now guaranteed that they've got to come on the podcast. Cheerio, everybody. Have a lovely time. Listen and pass on the word. Thank you very much. This has been the Ask Podcast recording today. Bye.